Blazing Rants are a segment where I discuss topics relating to the subject of video games and or anime. It contains my raw biased opinion and is created for the purpose of your debate, examination, or discussion. Now that that's cleared up, let us begin. Well, it looks like 2017 is finally upon us. It's a brand new year with a brand new attitude, and I feel the best way to start the year is with a Fire Emblem video, and I'm going to do what all Fire Emblem fans do. Complain about Fire Emblem Fates. Okay, in all seriousness, though I do love Fire Emblem Fates, I won't deny that the game has its flaws, in particular in regards to its writing and story. Now personally, I didn't think the story was that bad. In fact, there were many interesting ideas and themes present throughout the game, but it still had a lot of issues, either for being rushed, hiring a manga writer who's not familiar with the series, or perhaps all the writers just got shit-faced and wrote a crappy version of Code Geass. Though we'll see how that turns out. But the point is, this was a serious case of a wasted opportunity. So much so that if you recall in my last discussion video, I stated that I would love to spend another 15 minutes going about how I would improve the story, and many of you wanted to see those extra 15 minutes. Well, here are those extra 15 minutes, or however long this video is, as I go about offering up my own guide on how to improve Fire Emblem Fates' story. Please keep in mind that this video is purely opinion based and I'm simply outlining how I would improve the story, and since everyone has different views on what makes a good story, this is merely my take on the matter. Also keep in mind, I'm not changing the core story, just outlining areas of improvement, so at the end of the day both Nohr and Hoshida are at war, Corrin is the main character, and you still have to make a choice between the two. On that note, I'm also looking at the story in a more general sense, and I'm not breaking down Birthright, Conquest, and Revelations individually. And lastly, please keep in mind I am not a script writer, I'm not a distinguished author, and I don't have a degree in English literature. My area of expertise lies elsewhere, so please don't flip your shit if I miss out something or don't go as in-depth as others do. This is merely my take on the matter, and yes, I will be spoiling this plot, so be warned. With that said, let's get started. Step 1. More moral grey. Moral grey has always been a big part of Fire Emblem, showing the horrors of war and that no side is completely good or evil. This is something Fire Emblem Fates was severely lacking, since the game portrays Nohr to be the bad guys and Hoshida to be the good guys with no in between, and this really affected the grand narrative and the concept of making a choice between the two nations. With this in mind, I feel both nations have to be otherwise equal or close enough in terms of morality, and though there are many ways of doing this, I personally feel the best starting point is to elaborate on what Silas brought up during Birthright, where he explains that Nohr is a nation with little to no resources, and that they need to expand their territory in order to stay alive, with Ryoma having no knowledge of this, and explains that Hoshida is filled to the brim with resources, as well as seeing just how much the people are suffering in comparison. I feel this should be the base of the conflict between the nations, with Nohr's main goal being to fight for survival and just make the most out of whatever they can, and Hoshida are more about preservation and not getting involved with or helping other nations at the risk of something disrupting their way of life. Now naturally there can be other reasons to go alongside it, but this could make for a good starting point, making it so that yes, Nohr do conquer nations, but it's because they're desperate and have no other choice, and while yes Hoshida don't start any fights, they're focused purely on themselves and don't aid those in need. That way neither one is completely good or evil. On top of that, the game should expand upon how both Nohr and Hoshida have affected the other nations for both better and for worse, since they're pretty much this world's superpowers, as well as how the other nations view them, which brings me to my next point. Step 2. World building. World building is a big part of any story, and Fire Emblem is no different. Throughout the series, Fire Emblem has been able to tell grand stories and give their worlds a real sense of scope and liveliness. You want a good example of this? Just look at the Tellius series. This is another area Fates was really lacking in, since the game spends barely any time with the other nations and they're otherwise glanced over. This is something that needs to be expanded upon, as seeing more of each nation will really help with the scope of the game and make the world of Fates feel more alive. I mean hell, it can introduce us to more characters, new plot points, and more ideas and themes that could be explored in this narrative, but it could also emphasize the sense of moral grey that Fire Emblem is known for, especially in regards to how Nohr and Hoshida have affected the other nations. Think about it. Why not go into depth about how Nohr has ruined nations and stripped them of their resources in their conquest for survival, but have also benefited other nations by overthrowing corrupt rulers and governments or introducing their laws and lifestyle that have benefited the other nations in the long run. At the same time, you can show that Hoshida are on good terms with certain nations and don't start any conflicts, but also how they refuse to aid other nations and are indifferent to what goes on around them and not willing to make changes to how they live, leading those nations and their people to starve and suffer as a result. By doing this, we can sympathise with both sides and have reasons both for and against them invading each other, as well as seeing both nations from various perspectives. I mean, in Birthright there was evidence that Makusha had a bone to pick with Hoshida, and in Conquest both the Ice Tries and Shev weren't exactly happy with Nohr. Expand upon that, show us more of both the good and the bad of these nations, show us how nations like Azura and Sarkenzia view them since they're the otherwise neutral party, show us what the people of other nations think of Queen Makoto and King Garin. In fact, that's a perfect segue into my next point. Step 3. King Garin. If you want a textbook definition of wasted potential, look no further than Sonic 06, I mean King Garin. One of the main reasons Nor was made out to be the bad guys was because Garen was portrayed to be nothing more than a one-note villain who's just evil for the sake of being evil. Throughout the course of the game, Garen is shown to be nothing more than a one-dimensional asshole, and there really isn't anything redeeming about him. In fact, all he was missing was a toupee. This was made worse by the fact that 1. Fire Emblem has a history of creating loads of great villains that are evil, yet interesting and even sympathetic to an extent, and 2. There was so much potential with Garen based on his backstory and how others described him. Throughout Fire Emblem Fates, many characters refer to Garen as being this prestigious king back in his prime, and that now he is completely different to how he used to be. The problem is we never see any sign of Garen being this great person, just supports based around what he used to be like. If you want to make Garen a good, hell a great villain, we need to see both his light and his dark side. We need to see why so many people look up to him, as well as why they fear him so much. Let me give you an idea of how I would portray King Garen. Garen is a king who started out as honourable, proud and does what's best for his people and always puts them first, and he would often negotiate with other nations about sharing their resources and culture with Nor, only ever invading them as a last resort. One day he meets with Sumeragi in order to form an alliance with both nations in the hopes that Hoshida will help Nor and its people with their dwindling resources and bring about a new era of peace by working together. However, Sumeragi refuses Garen because he doesn't like the idea of anything changing how the way Hoshido is, and explains that only his people matter to him, not outsiders. This is when Garen flips out, murders Sumeragi and kidnaps Corrin, with Azura being kidnapped later on by Hoshido. From that day forward, Garen began to lose faith in negotiations and instead became more focused on simply conquering nations in order to sustain his people, but the more nations he conquered, the less of his humanity remained intact, as he became focused more on the results rather than the methods of his actions, and while it does help to keep his people alive, the way he goes about doing it isn't exactly just. This would explain why he has Hans and Iago as his henchmen. Yeah, they're scumbags, but they get the job done and their methods are very effective and produce results. In fact, it would probably explain why he worships the Nankos, so that he could gain the power to continue his conquest of nations. With this, you can see how Garen changed over time, and how what he does is both a benefit and detriment to Nor. Also, we need to see Garen acting like his past self from time to time in order to understand why he's seen as this great king. Picture, if you will, when Corrin chooses Nor and sees Garen again in Chapter 7, Garen embraces Corrin at the fact that he still chose his Norian family despite knowing the truth. Not only would this make him a more interesting character, but it would make us understand why people hold him in such high regard. And I'm not asking for a ton of this, you can still make Garen the villain, but we need to see him at both his best and his worst. That way we're more conflicted about fighting him in Birthright, and when we finally reach the end of Conquest and see his true form, it might actually be kind of sad to see this once great king fall to corruption and hatred. Step 4. Queen Makoto. If Garen was an example of wasted potential, Queen Makoto is the aftermath of that. Not to say she's a bad character, but the story really didn't do anything with her. Mainly because she dies very early on in the story, since she is the mother of the main character, and by anime logic it's pretty much the law that she dies, and is used more as a plot device to fuel Hoshido's hatred towards Nor. Personally, I feel Makoto should not have died, and that because of the events with Sumeragi and Garen, she became insistent on keeping Hoshido self-contained and is reluctant to get involved with other nations because of that day. This I feel would have made her a very interesting character, that while seen as a great queen to most of her people and understandable as to her cautious nature, is frowned upon by others because of her stubbornness and otherwise adamant attitude, as well as being seen as weak, obstinate and not willing to accept change. On top of that, she could be a character that develops a lot in each pathway, with the events in Birthright being used to really open her eyes and see how Nor and the other nations don't have it as easy as they do, while Conquest could further her resolve into getting Corrin back permanently, and she ends up becoming somewhat cold-hearted and merciless in her effort to do so, even to her own people. By doing this, we can see that both King Garen and Queen Makoto are not perfect leaders and most certainly flawed, but also more relatable characters and people that we can sympathise with for the most part. It's certainly better than Makoto suffering from anime mother syndrome, and Azura just telling us, oh by the way, Garen's a demon now, and we have to conquer Hoshido and make him sit in a chair in order to prove this. Speaking of which... Step 5. Azura Exposition. One of the biggest complaints in regards to Fate's story was that Azura seemed to know literally everything and was the one who explained everything to Corrin in order to otherwise fuel the motives of the story. This didn't go over too well since it leads to quite a few plot holes and some otherwise stupid moments. I mean seriously Azura, you couldn't have showed this to either Leo or Xander, it would have saved us a lot of trouble. However, in order to avoid Azura having the answer to everything, there's an easy remedy for this. She doesn't. I understand that Azura is meant to be the mystical guide that helps to strengthen Corrin's resolve and give context to certain situations. However, the fact that Azura literally explains everything to the audience removes any sort of mystery or tension the story has going for it, as well as getting rid of the idea of moral grey if she outright tells the player what the best course of action is with no argument. If you want the story to be more interesting, Azura should not have all the answers, since I feel the best types of stories are the ones that don't tell you everything and let the viewer figure out for themselves. Besides, wouldn't it be better if Azura played up the role of the neutral party instead? If Fate's story played out the way I described it, Azura would be more conflicted about joining either side, as she would have reasons to both fight for and against each nation, made all the more believable by the fact that she doesn't know everything that's going on, or the best way to go about resolving the conflict. Now that's not to say Azura can't help guide or influence the story. Oh no, she can still have outside knowledge to help contextualize certain situations, as well as knowing that her voice has the power to do things like cure corruption and expose people's inner demons. But wouldn't it be much more interesting if, say, Azura never went to the Bottomless Canyon or never even knew about Valor? Imagine if Azura, throughout both Birthright and Conquest, informs Corrin that her mother told her that apparently the Bottomless Canyon holds the answers to the unknown. However, until Revelations, they never get the chance to go to the Bottomless Canyon, making things more ambiguous and adding more mystery to the story. This would also do a much better job at foreshadowing Valor. Could you imagine if in Conquest we never go to Valor, and Gunter suddenly came back to us and all we got from him were very vague descriptions as to what happened down there? Or seeing Takumi turn into the monster that he is in Conquest because he went to the Bottomless Canyon? Or seeing Garen's true form at the end of Conquest with the only hint being his reaction at the Opera House? All of this would have made for a much more impactful story and done a better job at setting up Revelations. And on that note, Step 6. Valor. I know I wasn't going to talk about individual pathways, but I feel this needs to be addressed since it plays a part in all three stories. I get the feeling the developers had no idea what they wanted to do with Valor, since while the setup was cool, once we actually got there nothing really happened, and in terms of backstory, the game told us fucking nothing! After doing some research, and by that I mean going to the Fire Emblem wiki page, Valor is actually rather interesting, and it paints Nankos out to be more tragic, yet the game tells us nothing about this place, and makes Nankos out to be nothing more than a one-note asshole, and we've already got 3 of those! I feel that for Valor to work, the game needs to expand upon the events that took place and show both the dragon and human side of Nankos. It needs to show us the history of Valor, how it ties into Fate's lore, and the tragedy of Nankos' character, how over time he lost himself to the animal inside even though he tried his hardest to fight against it, but also how humanity quickly turned against him and shunned him after only a single incident, fueling his hatred and making the struggle more intense. Imagine if when arriving in Valor, the human side of Nankos greets the joined armies, and is the one guiding them through the kingdom and giving them backstory about this place, kinda like Yune from Radiant Dawn. Not only would this help to make Valor a more interesting place, but if written well, this version of Nankos could be a very likeable mentor figure that we grow to enjoy, and then when the player finds out the truth, they're more conflicted about taking down Nankos, knowing that the human side will die too, kinda like what they did with Robin and Grimmer, only this time it isn't forced and contrived. There's a reason I think Awakening has the weakest story. Not only that, but because of how both King Garen and Queen Mikoto aren't exactly ideal rulers, Nankos could be more understandable and wanted to destroy both kingdoms, seeing them as fallen from Grace kingdoms compared to how they started out. This is just me throwing ideas out there, but at the very least it would give us something of substance instead of just stop the evil dragon because the game says so. PS, we're charging you $20 for this, so fork it over. Step 7. A Royal Opportunity. The Fates Royals are one area I feel this game did very well in, giving us both great characters and great units in my opinion. However, in regards to the story, I don't feel they made enough of an impact on the narrative with the exception of Xander and Takumi. To be fair, it's not like they're completely irrelevant, and to Conquest credit, it gave each of the roles their moment to shine, even the Hoshido ones. The same cannot be said for Birthright and Revelations however, since be honest here, you could take Hinoka and Sakura out of the story and nothing would change in the grand scheme of things. And hell, in Birthright, Leo didn't do that much, and Camilla's only purpose was to go,
"Hey Corrin, did you know I have big tits? Because I have big tits. In 3D.
This was a massive missed opportunity since I feel each of the roles should have some significant bearing on all 3 stories and be the focus of certain points of the game, especially in regards to Hinoka and Sakura. Additionally, while I know the roles are deeply tied to Corrin, they should not be so focused on him in regards to their motivations, but rather they follow their own ambitions first and foremost throughout the story, and Corrin helps to change them for the better. Think about it, Xander's loyalty to his father and Camilla's protected nature could fuel their need to conquer nations in order to keep their loved ones alive and well, and Leo's tactical mind would drive him to make the best plans for achieving victory and recognition, as well as make the most out of what they gain for Nor's benefit, with Elise and Corrin being the ones to see and experience the aftermath of their actions, and while they both understand why they do these things, eventually they confront the other siblings about how much damage they're really doing. Alternatively, Ryoma and Takumi could be very distrusting and ignorant of outsiders because of their father's death, and merciless in regards to confrontations, with Hinoka being focused on fighting Nor in order to protect the ones she cares about but not fully considering her actions. However, Sakura, while afraid of getting involved and just as cautious at first, eventually musters up the courage with the help of Corrin to see what's going on in the rest of the world, and while she's just not going to forgive Nor for what happened, both her and Hinoka could at least realise how hard it is for them by seeing it firsthand and from what Corrin tells them while Ryoma and Takumi are fighting on the front lines, and eventually end up helping Ryoma and Takumi to become more trusting and open to the idea of change as well as worrying about others' problems. It certainly beats going 10 chapters and then thinking to yourself, wait a minute, wasn't Hinoka in this story at some point? And when did you get here, Sakura? Step 8. Choices. The biggest selling point about Fire Emblem Fates was that you could choose your pathway and experience different stories based on your choice. However, I feel we can take this one step further. In a game like Fire Emblem Fates, I felt the player should have more options throughout the game to decide what to do in certain situations, allowing us to expand upon certain events and see the aftermath of one's actions and how the characters react to it. Now you can do this at certain points in the game already, but they don't really add up to much in the end. But how cool would it have been if in Conquest, we could decide whether or not to spare or kill the rebellion in Sheev, and depending on your choice, you could either A, let them live and Scarlet, seeing that there is good in Nor, joins you, but then later on the remaining rebels sell you out to Hoshido, and let's say for example Elise gets severely wounded or someone on the team dies, kinda like how Kaze would die in Birthright if you didn't have an A support with him by a certain chapter, even though the game told you nothing about this beforehand. Yeah, that was pretty bullshit, Fates. This could cause Garen and the other siblings to berate you for being too naive and trusting, whereas if you let everyone die, you prevent being sold out, get some bonus items from the soldiers, and get Garen's approval, but at the same time you're not exactly helping Nor's image, which will affect you later down the line in another chapter, and characters like Elise and Felicia begin to doubt you. Stuff like this would make the story more engaging and show that sometimes what you think is the right choice might end up hurting others in the long run. Plus it could allow for some bonus chapters or characters to be unlocked based on what you pick. I mean, if Corrin is meant to be an avatar, we should at least have the option to influence his choices, which brings me to my last point. And finally, step 9, Corrin. Oh man, I bet you're all thinking the same thing. Oh boy, BlazingKnight is going to bitch about how much he hates Corrin for the next 5 hours. Better get out the Jack Daniels then. Oh you people, I would never make you listen to me bitch about Corrin for 5 hours. Just 3. In all seriousness, while yes, I have made it apparent in the past that I hate Corrin, that's not to say I hate everything about him, just the majority. For one thing, I like the idea behind Corrin, and I like how for the first 6 chapters he was naive to the world around him, but had a good heart and a strong resolve. The problem was that once Corrin decides which path to follow, he doesn't change. Like, at all. This is a big problem since a decision like this is meant to rip Corrin in half and scar him for life. He's got to choose between 2 sides knowing that one will lose and that either family might die, yet he's still just as naive and upbeat as he was at the start, almost like nothing happened, and it's difficult for the story to engage the viewer since we don't feel like Corrin is evolving as a character because he doesn't change. I felt Corrin should have been more of the neutral party and used his knowledge and experience with each nation to change either one for the better, which would have worked really well if both nations were shown to be equal on the morality scale, making the choice Corrin makes all the more difficult since he's got just as much reason to choose Nor as he does Hoshido. To me personally, I felt what Corrin desperately needed was to become a darker character. No, I don't want him to become moping and broody. Corrin can still be upbeat and kind-hearted, but I'm sorry, I just have trouble believing that regardless of which family he chooses, Corrin wouldn't have some form of resentment or hostility towards them. In my eyes, Corrin should have been rather cold to Hoshido since they're otherwise strangers to him and get defensive whenever they say things like Nori and scum, but at the same time, he should have been distrusting towards Nor because they lied to him all his life and remind his siblings that they're not his real family whenever they try to get close. Stuff like this would have made Corrin more relatable and shown that he's not a clean-cut character, but at the end of the day, Corrin will be the one to bridge the gap between the nations and change them for the better. This would make the story as a whole more tragic and powerful, showing us that whether you like it or not, sometimes you're gonna have to make a choice, and you have to live with that choice for the rest of your life. Sometimes there's not a clear right or wrong answer. Sometimes you can't have it your own way. Sometimes your choice may backfire on you. Sometimes your actions will have severe consequences, and sometimes learning the truth can be painful. Hell, it can outright change everything you've come to know. But ultimately, when you do make that choice, you should stay by your decision and fight for what you believe in and the ones you love. Because while you may not be right in the eyes of others, it is what you feel is the best for yourself and the ones that matter to you the most, no matter how much it hurts you to do so. And that is the message behind Fire Emblem Fates. And that's my guide on how I would improve Fire Emblem Fates' story. I hope you all enjoyed this video and it was worth the wait. Feel free to tell me your thoughts. Did you agree with me? Did you disagree with me? Knowing my luck, probably. Is there something I missed? And how would you go about improving Fate's story? Let me know in the comments below, and please let me know if you would like to see more videos like this where I talk about how to improve something, because I've got a lot of ideas of how to improve these video games and anime. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching, and here's to a brand new year, because I've got big plans for this year and I'm just getting started. In the meantime, be sure to check out my previous video, Top 10 Anime of 2016, and if you haven't already, be sure to check out my first discussion video, Have Awakening and Fates Ruined Fire Emblem. Once again, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like this video, leave a comment if you feel the need to, and why not subscribe to my channel if you like these types of videos and want to see more. Also, don't forget to follow me on Twitter at BlazingKnight and on Amino as well if you want to just keep updated with what I'm doing or just have a friendly chat with me. Anyway, that's it from me. I'll see you all next time.